So we covered a bit about promises earlier on in the bootcamp. We're going to cover them again in a little more detail, and we're going to dive a bit deeper into them and go a little slower over some of the main points of promises. Let's build one right now. I'm going to do an example. We'll use Postgres because that's what we're used to right now, and then we'll move on to something a little more fun after that. There's our typical Postgres pattern. We require our PG library and we'll build ourselves a pool. And has anybody downloaded the skeleton code for the midterms yet? Because this is kind of exactly what they have in it. They've got a pool with some stuff. And there actually is a database called Midterm, which you might want to use, you might not, but it's part of. So this is really your setup for using the PG library. And this is nothing to do with promises, this is getting myself set up. So I'm going to make myself a promise. So when I use a PG library, I'll make myself a variable. And I'll call it query, sure, equals, and I'm going to select something from my database. I'll select, ID and name from users, and I'll say limit 5. There. So far, this is not promises. This is just doing some simple stuff. All right, so let's call a promise. I'm going to pool.query. There we go. So pool.query, and I'll use my query. So there is an example of a function that is promise-based. It's the PG pool, and I'm going to call a query with my code. So what happens now is Postgres will go ahead and execute my query. But of course, this is of no use to me because it's not telling me anything. If I simply go my const results, log our results. There. Let's run it and see what we get. And I get a promise. I get a pending promise, which means a promise has been started, but it hasn't been resolved yet. And that's exactly what I expect. The query function of Postgres in a Postgres pool returns a promise. And this is what we work with a lot in modules. We work with functions that return a promise. We do this a lot. You probably have dealt with this a lot already. Remember in the LightBnB, where we had to return a promise from our API, and then another function would then that promise. So to use a promise, we have to use the then keyword, and that's what we do. So that results is simply a promise. So I could simply say results.then. So I call the then function on that promise. Once again, it doesn't do anything. All it's doing is calling then. The interesting thing about promises is the promise starts executing right there, not on the then. So when you start that query, that process starts as a process in your system. So what JavaScript is doing, it's telling your computer, start that query going. And although your own code is what's called single-threaded, which means it can't be interrupted. So this query, although it may finish before your code is finished, you're not going to be able to access it until the end of your code. So JavaScript, your code is single-threaded, but your computer is not. So I could start 10 queries going at the same time, and they can all go running at the same time, but I won't be able to look at them until JavaScript is not busy. All right, so that's your typical pattern. Of course, I have to query that then. So we would normally do something like results. We put in a callback function, and we say, well, console log. We'll just log the results. So a console log, the res. In this case, I know that what I get back from Postgres is I get back some rows. And that's what I get back from Postgres, res.rows. Let's take a look. So I've got my results is a promise, which I'm getting back from this function, pool.query. And there is your pattern for accessing a promise. You give it a callback function. Let's try that. And I get back my stuff, res.rows. I could go res. Let's take a look. What I get back is res instead. And it's a lot of stuff. So There's a bunch of other stuff, res.row count, that's kind of cool. Res.fields, oh, it just tells what the fields are, that's kind of cool. But really res.rows, that's the meat of what I'm really looking for. So you would almost always go res.rows, and that is unique to Postgres, not to promises. So now the way we normally do it is do it like this. We take the then on the next line, and this is how we normally write a promise or the code for handling the callback promise. Now I've done it using error notation, kind of the shorthand. We could, of course, do this. If we went to more than one line, we do this instead. There, and then, oops, and I can do a few things. There we go, and I can console log. Come on. These are my rows. We're going to start off slow here with promises. So this is your pattern. Your promise dot then, and inside the then is going to be some function. Now I've written this as an anonymous function. Run this again. Back, I'll clear the screen. There. So these are my rows, and I get my rows. Okay. So this is your basic pattern for calling a promise and running the then. The then simply reads the contents of the promise. Now that's a really interesting point. Let's do it again. Let's do the same thing with the same promise. I'm going to then this promise again and see what happens. It's the same promise, results. I'll run it again. I get it twice. It's important to note that it did not execute my query twice. That promise or that process ran once. The results object is simply holding on to the information for me. So I can then as many times as I want on the same results. Okay. Any questions so far on promises? So we have almost always have functions that return a promise. Okay. Try something else. So what I've got, let's try and return something else from promise. So remember, a promise always has a dot then. So sometimes you want to chain a promise or make a promise happen one after the other. So let's talk about how that works. In a promise or in the then, anything you return from that then becomes available to the next then in the chain. So let's do another dot then. In fact, let's just copy your dot then like this. And we'll put two dot thens on the same promise. So now I'm actually calling dot then and then dot then again. It's a chain of dot thens. Log we got back. Okay. Let's watch what happens. Okay. So my first then fired. I got my rows and I got my rows. Then I got undefined. That's interesting. My then, it worked, but I got back undefined. Anybody want to guess why I got back undefined here? And this is one of the huge takeaways I want you guys to remember from promises, is the return from a then is always another promise, which means you can then it again. So what's happening here is I'm actually calling dot then, and that dot then function is returning another promise, which I could then dot then again. And someone says the first didn't return anything. You're exactly right. In fact, it did return something. It returned, what's the JavaScript word for nothing? What's the JavaScript word for nothing? Null, that's one of them, but not there, can't find it. You didn't do anything. What's the other JavaScript word for that one? Undefined, exactly right. In fact, we did return something, in a manner of speaking, we returned undefined. Let's fix that. Let's return something. Let's return, I don't know, turn 8. Let's return 8 from our then. So Now our then is returning an 8. Let's see what we get. And to no surprise, we got an 8. Okay, in fact, let's put something else. Let's put a little string in there so we can see what we got. We'll say the then. There we go. We'll make it really clear that this is coming back from our then. Copy that and paste there. There we go. Okay. Let's run it again. And so there's my first then that ran, and there's my second then. Okay, the question is, does the results variable hold the res object or the return promise? It holds whatever was, well, depends. If you returned a promise from this, you will get whatever that promise resolved. In this case, I am returning 8. So 8 is going to be whatever I returned. So if the return from it then is a value, if it is a value, you will get that value in the next res of the next then. And that's how you chain information and promises. If you remember what we did, in fact, we did this in our exercise in our database. We actually returned res.rows, didn't we? There. So now we have res, but we're going to take the rows part out of that and return res.rows now. Interesting. In fact, let's return row count. There we go. Okay. So now what we'll do is we will have our first then print out the row count. And then we're going to pass the res.rows along to the next then in the chain. And we're going to print out what it gets as a res. Okay, let's give it a try. And we did. We got then, I suppose we probably should have said then, comma, rows to make it more clear, right? There we go. Okay. There we go. 5 rows, then, and there are rows right there. Okay. We did something very similar in our LightBNB, didn't we? We passed rows 0 when we wanted the user, because we know that it's one user, and we passed res.rows to then. And that's why we did that, because I returned this to a function. So, and that function was also doing a then in the chain. Now, it wasn't a then on the same promise, because this is now a different promise. Every time I do a then, this creates a new promise in the chain. I can still get this, results dot then. In fact, let me grab this again. There. Let's grab my original promise and let's print out the rows and see what happens. So this was the original promise. There we go. Okay, so what's happening is I'm printing out my 2 rows here, and this, the asynchronous nature, is actually executing this first is what's happening, because this one's running, then it's doing callbacks. This one got called first, so it actually gets fired first, and then that happens. That's just the way asynchronous JavaScript works. It's kind of weird, but all right. Okay, so let me see. The question is, so it just gives you the resolved value. Yes, that's exactly right. If it's a value, it's just the value. So normally, when we're calling a promise like this, we wouldn't normally go, promise equals that. We would simply just call the function inline like this, wouldn't we? We would just do that. We wouldn't have an intermediate value. We would say, whoops, pool.query query. There, let's rename that one. Let's call it SQL. Sure. Okay. So run this, same results. We get 5 rows and our stuff. Now, let's call another and do them in order, because there are sometimes maybe you want to do one promise and then execute a second promise, but not until the first promise is finished, because we might want to use some information from that first promise. Everyone remember the ISS assignment? That was week 2, right? Wasn't that fun with all these chained callbacks? A lot easier, of course, the promise version. So now let's do another one. Let's do inside our first query, or inside our second one rather. We'll console log the res, and then let's do another query. Let's do another select. We'll do select ID. So now we're going to do another query inside our then. So select ID name from, and I've got another table called widgets. There we go. And I'll also limit 5 there. Okay, so now I'm going to call that. And now I'm going to return a promise. So now I'm not just returning a value, I'm returning another promise from my .then. It's a different query. So I'm going to print out my rows and then return another promise, which means there's going to be another then in there. So .then, same thing, res. There we go. And I'll keep my little curly braces because they're useful. There we go. And I'm going to console log my, I'll say then again. There. And let's do res.rows, because now this is going to be the results of that promise. And I know that PG pool.query always returns a res with a res.rows in it. So this is being returned by this then. Don't you love JavaScript? This then, or this there then is even better. So this return or promise is being returned by this there then, which means it's available to the next then in the chain. There we go, .then, just like that. All right, oops, semicolon. There we go. So now I'm returning a promise from my then. It should be available to this then. Res.rows, there we go. Okay, try it again. And there we go. I got my first query, and then I got my second query in order. And that's really useful. The fact that it happens in order. When we're doing backend programming, this can be very, very useful. You want to execute one query, then another. I mean, you would try, if possible, to do a join and do it all in one query, but there are some times you really need to do one operation and then another operation as a promise in order. Okay, so once again, big takeaway, whatever is returned by the then is what's available. And there is always another then. There's always one, like there just is. So I could put thens forever. So console log res there. And well, another console log then. Until you stop. Look at that, I got undefined. If I put another then in that chain and keep on going like that, I can go forever. There's always another then if you want. So you got to stop somewhere, but it always generates a promise. .then always produces a promise, so you could always make another then. That's a cool point. All right, that's a bit too much thens, isn't it? Okay. All right. So now you notice that last time I had a problem. I said limit, right? It's like, oh, okay, let's run my code. And I got this, oh man, unhandled promise rejection. Has anybody seen this error before? Has anybody not seen the error before? Not me. You see this all the time, unhandled promise rejection. So the thing about promises is you got to be able to handle rejection. So, and the way we do that, of course, which is with a what? How do we handle rejection in promises anyways? With a catch, correct. We use a catch. So we will put a dot catch, just like this. It also takes a function. I'm going to go error or E. Error sounds good. And let's console log. This is log my error. Log my error. So now I'm handling the rejection somehow. Okay. So run it again. I'll put the word catch just to know it came from me. Let's put the word catch just like that. There we go. Okay. Let's run our again. And now we get, now this error is now from us. It's still pretty long, but it's a little more readable. So this now came from me. And the question is, will this catch then catch errors from every then? The answer is yes, and then some. And that's a great segue. So I'll get to that in a second. So here I've got my error. It's a pretty long error. So it's an object with a bunch of other stuff in it. It's got a stack trace built into it, which is kind of hard to access directly, and a bunch of stuff. So I don't know. I'm just going to go error dot, what can I grab out of here? Severity, maybe code. This stuff is a bit trickier to grab because it's what's called a stack trace, and it's not really available to you as an object item. So I'm just going to grab the code. It's error.code. There we go. Run it again. Okay. Catch and then error code 42601. Of course, totally obvious what that error is. A good old 42601 error, missing number on your limit. I knew that. Okay, so let's talk about catch. So catch catches any error in any then before it. That's correct. Every error before that, it will. So if I have a good one here, so it should run now, and it does. Let's mess this one up. Let's say limit f. Okay, I'm going to try to go limit 5. Let's run that. And sure enough, I get the good old 42601 error again. Great. So it did in fact catch any error from any promise above the catch. But wait, there's more. Everyone says old commercials about late night commercials, but wait, there's more. Yes, there is more. Let's try something else. Let's do the following thing. Let's say I made a mistake and I did this. I said console log. It's like, oh, I've done that. Anybody misspelled anything in JavaScript before? Yes, of course, we always do that. We make mistakes. So let's see what happens there. Okay. Look at that. Now it caught my JavaScript error, not just my promise error. That catch caught any error that happened in any code above it. How cool is that? Right? Not just errors in my promises. It caught like all kinds of stuff. It caught my other screw ups, including my logagug, right? So there, I fixed my code. Let's do a logagug here instead. Let's run it again. And it ran my rows, and then, oh, it caught that error. Console logagug is not a function. Why? You're right, it's not a function. So this can actually be a little bit disconcerting because you go, what's wrong with it? It's undefined. But in actual fact, it may not be a problem with your promise. It might be a problem with your actual code. This happens all the time. Okay, so things to watch out for. It may not be an actual error in one of these. It may be an error someplace else. This happens all the time to me. I'm looking at my promise going, what's wrong? They're all perfect. And it's actually something silly I've done in actual code later on, maybe an undefined. Quite often you'll be on something undefined. Okay, once again, let's look at how catch works. After a catch, let's do a dot then again, reset res, and we'll do the same thing. We'll console log our res. So log our res, there we go. Okay, what's going to happen here? Let's take a look. I get undefined. That's interesting. Why did I get undefined? Let's take a look. As it turns out, the same rules apply for a catch and for a then. Anything you return from a catch is also another promise. So if I return 5 from my catch, I'm going to get the catch never fired. Let's make an error. So there, now I have an error. And there, now the catch fired, it returned to 5, and the 5 became available to the next then in the chain. So that's how they work in orders like that. Okay. So any questions so far on how a catch and then work? They're fairly simple. It's difficult or easy rather to overthink how they work. They're really just then, and the catch. Okay, here's a question. Should we be handling JS errors differently? For most of Bootcamp, we're not going to be doing anything more exotic for catching exceptions. So just keep it in mind that if you've got a then chain with a catch, it will also catch actual JavaScript errors inside that catch, things to work out for. Okay, so we have our catch is returning a 5. So big takeaway from today, I know I'm repeating this a few times, a then or a catch, anything you return from those two, that becomes available to the next then in a chain. In fact, it's so reliable that it's a resolved promise. In other words, anything you return, if it's a value, it is a guaranteed resolved promise. So there can never be a catch below this, because this catch caught that there, it's returning 5. This is a resolved promise, which means there can only be thens below that, unless, of course, I console log again, in which case I've got a catch. But we don't normally rely on a promise catch to handle our JavaScript errors, so it wouldn't be really good practice. But just keep in mind that when you return something from a then or a catch, it becomes available to the next then in the chain. If you return a promise, it can be a then or a catch. If you return a value, it's going to be a then. Okay. So let's talk about one more thing. There's one more thing we can do that we use in promises. We have then and we have catch. There's a third keyword that we use. What's that one that we use for promises? The third one that we actually use a lot, and particularly in databases, we use this one. We have catch and we have one called finally. It's called the finally. So there's a dot finally. And this is actually pretty important. It's used in a lot of ways. It takes no parameters, so it needs a callback function, and we'll give it some stuff there. And we'll just log finally, because not much else to do here. So I'll just say finally. There we go. A finally runs all the time. You know, win, lose, or draw, or basically then, or catch. It runs at the end no matter what. So whether the then or a catch fired, the finally always runs. So I run this. There we go. Oh, and I still got my limit 5. Log, oh, of course, I got my catch. So my catch fired, log is not a function, and my finally fired. Great. Let's get rid of my typo. Now there should be no error, and it runs, but my finally still fires. So a finally will always fire. Now here's a really interesting point. Especially in this case, you notice my code is actually delaying. Look at that. I run it and it's like this big delay, like what's happening? It's sitting there and it's not returning back to my OS. Everyone loved my my old school Windows XP looking desktop. Someone says pool.end. That's exactly right. I want to clear my pool when I'm done, but I can't do that yet because it might mess me up. So I've got to be careful. I can't really do a pool.end yet, because these things may still be executing. If I had a long query and I end the pool, my query finishes. So inside the finally, yes, that's exactly where I'd put it. I would end my pool inside the finally. Okay, another question is, so is finally treated just like a then? Can you chain off it? Let's give that a try. That's an excellent question. Can we chain off of a finally? Dot then. That's a great question. Let's grab one of these. Grab this one. There's a then we can chain off. Excellent question. And we'll just do res. And we'll say then finally. There we go. Let's try that. That's a fantastic question. Okay, let's try it. So we got this, pool end, then finally. It fired. So yes, it did return a promise as well, undefined. Let's try and return something from our finally. Take a look. I don't know. Return 6. Take a look. Look at that, huh? I returned 6, but it didn't give me a 6. Nope, didn't get anything. So apparently not. Okay. It does return a promise, but really it returns a promise with nothing in it. Right. So, okay. Anyway, so there is your basic promise patterns. Then, catch. And you can do a catch. You can do catch above and then do another then, which means you could then use your catch and then do something else. Maybe do a second query inside the catch, and then you can continue on the chain. Okay. Let's try something a little more fun, because databases, although they're horribly fascinating, are not as interesting as other stuff. So let's clear this out. We're going to try something else. Okay. Instead, we're going to have some fun. Here we go. Okay. We're going to use the Axios library. So we'll acquire that. We'll go with const. And this is something you will use a lot, is the Axios library. Okay, so Axios equals require, and we'll require the Axios library. Axios. There. Let's run my code to make sure I've included the library, and cannot find module Axios. Okay. So I need to npm install Axios. There we go. Let's try that. So npm install Axios. There we go. So now run my code again. No errors. Okay. Okay. The question was, does the catch position matter? It does. The catch will catch anything from above it. So then catch. If there's another then and more stuff happening below that catch up top will not catch that. So the catch catches things just or immediately above it, or anything above it really, or anything, I guess, since the last catch. Is it best practice to have a catch? Yes, I would say so. Unless you know there literally, or there really cannot be a error. And as my last act today, I will show how that can happen. Okay, Axios. Okay, finally, there's tons of cases. Database cleanup. That's one of the more common ones. Cleaning up a database when you're done, that is a finally. Or if there's something you really want to have done, no matter what, like no matter what happens, still run this code because it's so critical. It has got to happen before my function exits. So that's a design choice. Okay, so let's use something. I'm going to use a library. There. I'm going to call a URL. It is api.kanye.rest. And this is a real thing. It is an API that I'm going to call. And probably in your midterms, and definitely the week after in React week, you'll be using Axios to call APIs. This is an API. It's kanye.rest. So let's actually go there and actually go in my browser and see what we get back if we go to api.kanye.rest. We'll say open, get a browser, and look at this. We get back a very great quote, which says, I give up drinking every week. Look at that. So you get back a very profound quote every time you run this API. And let's look at it. In fact, what I'm getting back is I'm getting back an object with a key called quote, which contains a value of a string. And this is what you normally do. When you use an API, you know how it works. There may be some documentation, there may not. So you go to your browser and just call the API and take a look. What do I get back from this thing? Well, it looks like I get back an object which contains a quote key. Let's take advantage of that. So let's call a promise. Let's go, we'll do axios.get. And this is the way we use Axios to a get. This is very, very similar to the AJAX calls in jQuery, which you've all done, but it's actually even easier. So axios.get, we'll call with our URL, just like that. And let's do a dot then. Dot then, there. And the usual pattern is going to be with my res and a function that will handle my data. Okay, so I've got my res. Now remember in Postgres. It was res.rows. Well, I can't do res.rows here because this is not Postgres. There's always a res because that's my main parameter I can get back in the callback for promises. But everything after the res, that depends on what you're calling. In this case, I'm using Axios. When I was using PG, Postgres, my res would be an object which contained a bunch of stuff, including rows. So let's just see what I get back from Axios. Res, and let's console log a res. So log res. There we go. Don't do this at home, please. Don't try this at home. All right. So let's run this and see what happens. So, oops, we can see it. There we go. All right. Whoa. Lots of stuff. Like that is one big res. And you've probably seen something like this before, haven't you? Remember in the fetch in week 2, we talked, or week 3, we talked about HTTP. This looks an awful lot like the object you get back when you do an HTTP call, which of course is exactly what Axios is doing. It has its own flavor of it, but this is an Axios res object. It's big. Status text, okay, I got an okay back, got some headers and stuff back. Really the important thing you get back is the thing called data, wherever that is. But in Axios is data. So we want res.data. That's what I want. So this part, that's promise. But anything after that, the dot something, that is what you get back from the particular function that you called. Postgres, it was dot rows. Axios is dot data. Okay, let's run it again. And great, we will be recognized. Yes, we will. Awesome. Okay, so look at that. I got back an object that contains a quote key with the value of some text. Great. So I can even use that. Now I know how to use my API. I can go res.data.quote. Great. Let's try that. Oh, look at that. If I don't scream, let me go bigger. If I don't scream, if I don't say something, then no one's going to say anything. How true. Okay. So same rules apply. We can do a catch on an Axios promise. We'll do a dot catch. And we'll do our error. Same thing. And we will just log our error. Log, come on, console log. There it is, console log error. So what does an error look like in Axios? I'm not sure, but I'm going to find out. Okay, so I'm going to console log just the error. Let's make a mistake in our URL. Let's just say, I don't know, APII. There. We made a mistake in our URL. So Axios is probably going to give us an error. Let's try it. And I got back an error object, another big object. So what can I use? Error, no, that's kind of useful. Not found? Sure. Okay, so I got back an error. Let's say I'm going to log error.error no. Okay, run it again, and I get an error, and it should say not found. So you're right. It's like, oh, I made a mistake. That's right. I spelt my URL wrong. Okay, once again, call Axios. Okay. I will channel Will Ferrell while I'm at the daddy-daughter dances. God, that's great. Cool. Okay. So there's that. Okay. Let's try something else. Oops. Why don't we chain 2 of these together? So let's call a couple of these all at once. We're going to chain these promises together. So I've got my first promise, axios.getURL. Let's log that and let's call another one. Let's go another axios.get, the same URL. There. URL. It's like that. And of course, we'll call it, but we have to return it because in order for it to be available to the next, then we have to return from that then. This is something we forget a lot of times. We forget to return the results of our promise back. So now I can make this available to another then in the chain and another. So now one more there, and we'll just not call it the last time. There we go. So now I'm chaining 1, 2, 3, and 4 Kanye quotes. This is awesome. Okay, let's see if this works. I've got my Axios.gen, .then. I've got my .then, log the quote, return from my then, which returns a promise from that then, which is then thenable. I love that word, thenable. So I can do a then on it, and I'll probably get back another quote. Let's try it again. See what we get. And they happen one after the other. It's kind of hard to see, but there is a bit of a delay. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and they do fire one after the other. So I'm the new Moses, keep squares out of your circle. Yes. I can watch this all day. Tweeting is legal and also therapeutic. Wow. People always say can't please everyone all the time. That's a long one. Wow. Anyway, these are really profound. Okay, so that is chaining promises. All right, let's do more. Wow, this is like just stop and like just absorb the good karma here. This is great. I love this stuff. Wow. Ah, one more. I'm sorry, I gotta look at more of the stuff. Keep going. Come on. Unless Kanye locks me out. Oh, there we go. Did it once. I got back this. Gary, stop using my site. Okay. Oh, look at this. People tried talking me out of running for president. Never let weak, controlling people kill your spirit. Awesome. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. My voice, I'm sure Kanye's voice is much better than mine. I am the new Moses. Yes. Okay. Let's try something else. Let's do one more pattern, which is a really cool one. It's called the promise.all. All right. A promise.all is really interesting. We can call things like this one after the other in promises, because we know that anything we return from the then is going to be available to the next then. But we may also want to run a couple things all at once. And that's what promise.all does for us. So let's try this. Instead of having one promise, let's clean this up. We'll actually remove this. I'll leave my catch because that's kind of useful. There. I'm going to call a bunch of promises instead. So I'll make some variables. Const, promise one equals my Axios.get. I'll call the same URL. I'll change it a bit too. There. I'll do 3 promises, 1, 2, and 3. There. And I'm going to use the promise.all. And a promise.all, as you probably remember, executes, well, all. It runs all the promises all at once. So I have 3 promises. And we talked about earlier, these start happening right here. So these are already running. By the time I get to line 10, these have started. So it's not how to get them started, it's how to get the information back from them. They will run immediately upon doing the Axios.get. So now I want to get them back. So I will do a promise.all, and that's how it works. You do a promise.all, and a promise.all takes a parameter of an array of promises. It takes an array of the promises you want to query. 1, so let's grab a promise. 1, 2, 3, and it'll be 1, 2, and 3. Just like that. And that's how promise.all works. And then it's a then. There is a then on a promise.all. Oh, come on. Then, there we go, .then. All right. So we have our .then, but it's not your usual .then. There is a res, so it does take a callback function with the res, but it's not the same as the previous .then. In this case, my res is not just my value or my res.data, from the promise from my Axios. In this case, res is now an array of reses, essentially. I could say res array, I suppose, just to make it clear. I get back a res array. Okay, the question is, do multiple promises have to be in an array of promise.all? Yes, it expects a promise. Sorry, it expects an array. So promise.all expects an array as its parameter. Okay, so here we go. So I have my res array. Well, I could just do this. I could do a log of res array. So now I have res array, but I can't go dot data because it's an array. But I'll just take the first one. I'll do it the cheap and lazy way. There we go. Res.array dot data. There is my first one, and my second, and my third. So res array 0, 1, and 2. There we go. And let's see if I do get back 3 happening all at once now. And I did. Great. I give up drinking every week. Oh, doesn't that just, that is just beyond words. Like, wow. Wow. The world is our family. Oh, awesome. Do some more. I'm the best. Yes. Artists or founders. Oh, yes. Wow. We used to diss Michael Jackson. Oh, awesome stuff. Wow. Oh, some of these are just amazing. Wow. This is just amazing, isn't it? Okay. So there's a promise.all. By the way, catch works the same way. There we go. Catch is still the same. It still takes a single error. It's like, oh, wait a second. Catch does not give me back an array of errors. I just get back an error. Let's mess up here. Let's, once again, do one of these. Okay. And now I'm going to get back a single catch not found. Okay. So now let's put these, instead of putting in a variable here, let's actually put these right inside our Axios.get and only mess up one of them. It's like this. So don't need that anymore. Okay, let's mess up the second one. There, just like that, and see what happens. So run again, and I get, well, not found. Well, which one's not found? It's not telling me. It's like, one was not found. It's like, uh-oh, doesn't really help me. So here's one of the catches, no pun intended, of using promise.all, is that if one fails, they all for one and all for fail, essentially, or all for catch. If one fails, they all fail. So, and the catch does not tell you which one failed. So that's a bit of a problem, but there are ways to overcome that. One of them is there's a new construct in JavaScript. I won't talk about that today, but it is one that actually deals with this specific thing. It's really, really interesting. But we'll do it using a standard promise, okay? Not ideal, but it will work. So let's try this. We do know that the return from a then or a catch is always a promise, isn't it? In fact, it's always a resolved promise. If I return something from a then or from a catch, if I return a value, then I'm guaranteed that's always going to have a then. It will never catch because I'm returning a value like 5 or 8 or a string. So if I return just a value from a promise, that value will always just be thenable. It will never catch. So essentially, if I have a catch after each one of these promises, I'll never have to worry about it catching here. So what I can do is catch it here. I can catch it, essentially pre-catch my promise. And can anybody see what I'm doing here? There. Take a look at that. There. So what am I doing here? It's a bit of a ES6 shorthand there, but what am I actually doing? Yes, I'm returning the error object from my catch. What does that mean? So now my promise all contains now those 3 catches. So now these are now catches, and those catches are returning a pre-caught error essentially. So now if I do have a mistake in one, let's see what happens. Great. In fact, I get 2, right? Of course, undefined, because that's error no now, but that's what happens. I get my first one works, my second one didn't work, and there is no data because in data, that assumed it worked. Go error no, I suppose. Error no. Try that. Oh, error no. There. Try it again. It's thinking. It's thinking. There we go. Not found. So it ran my 2 promises, got the results, but because the trick, or because I know that the return from a catch is always a venable promise, this catch will never fire. Unless, of course, I have an actual mistake in there, right? So yeah, the first and third work because there's no error. So there's no error object. That's exactly right, right? So once again, though, if I did this like that, now I've got a really nasty error inside here. What's going to happen now? Of course, it's going to catch my JavaScript error inside my catch here. See what happens. And, well, undefined, right? So in this case, I log the error no. Let's log error by itself. So there we go. Try it again. And I'm going to get a JavaScript error now. So res array is not defined. So it caught my JavaScript error. So good thing to keep in mind when you're doing promises, remember that you can actually catch JavaScript errors as well. So, all right. So that's kind of a short review of promises. Anybody have any questions regarding what we covered today? It takes a bit of practice. Don't overthink promises. Just remember that the then, you can always chain the then into something else. You can always re-then the same promise if you want to. And the return value from the then is what's available to the next then in the chain. All right. Okay, everyone. Well, thanks
I have a
for...
question, actually.
Oh, yeah, sure. Go ahead. You did.
Sorry. So, for example, in line 7, in the catch, if instead of returning the error, you would console log it, how would that be different? Or
I certainly could. Yes, if I'd simply console log, let's try that. Instead of returning the error, let's do a console log of the error instead. E.error no, because E is a really big object, isn't it? Let's do that. So now, error no. Now, what is my catch returning now? What does that catch function return?
nothing?
Oh, E, hold on. There. Yes, because, well, it's actually returning whatever console log returns. And what does console log return? It returns nothing, undefined. So now it's going to return undefined from the catch. So now if I console log whatever I get back from, what's the third one actually? Let's actually make an error here. I put my error here because, in fact, let's run this way instead. Since this catch never gets fired, so this catch never fires, it will never happen. It'll still go straight to the then. Is that your question? If I did something inside here, this catch just passes it through. It'll say, I don't have to worry about this. It'll pass it through and the next then will catch it. So let's take a look, see what happens. So if I didn't return the object, I'm just going to handle it and return nothing. And let's actually give it good data. There we go. And data there. Okay, let's take a look. And it works. This catch never fired at all. It simply passed the res right through it as if it wasn't there. That's an interesting point because even though we're calling catch, it is just passing really the object through and not touching it at all. Okay, so that's how catches work. But now, of course, since I'm not catching anything here, it's going to log that and be undefined when it comes through again. So there'll be no, when I try to log that one, I'm going to get that's undefined, which means this one's going to fire and say it's undefined. So that's kind of scary. See if it works. Huh, it did. Look at that. So it did fire right here, and it said cannot read property of undefined, because here I'm returning undefined. It got wrapped up as a promise, which means the then got it, and it said, oh, okay, undefined dot data. Well, there is no data of undefined, so I get the error saying, well, this is an error, which means was a JavaScript error, which means this catch caught it, and it said, I'm sorry, you can't do that because there is no data in undefined. So, okay. Any more questions on promises? When to use the finally? You don't have to use it. In this case, there's no need for it. I mean, I could say done. Maybe I'd logged in and I had a process where I had to first log in and then log out. Maybe I wanted to. So I would do it finally. Finally. Now, in this case, it's not. I don't have to do that. But let's say I had an API where I literally had to do that. Had to do a log out. Oh, log out, for instance. Then sure. It's not really a speed thing. It's simply when you want to do something regardless of whether a then or a catch happened. So for example, if I hadn't pre-caught these things, let's go back to the original again. Let's go here. There we go, like that. There, take these off again. So now these are just regular promises with no weird pre-catching stuff happening here. There we go. Okay, so now I've got a catch. And console log error.error no. There. Okay. So, and oh, got two eyes. So let's just watch this happen. So right now, runs normally. So in this case, my catch fires because one of my promises got fired. If I had my catch here, well, what's going to happen? Let's take a look. It's fine because the catch never fired. So this then still got fired. But if I had my error here, now this catch is going to fire, which means I'm going to end up with an error in one of my, or in here essentially. And it's not going to be an array anymore, and it's really going to blow up in my face. So I probably shouldn't be doing that. Okay. Any other questions on this? So finally is not really a bypass. Finally is simply a do it regardless of whether you have a then or a catch. Okay, so we can talk about the resolve reject. Well, they're not really a type of promise. That's when you make a promise. You can make a promise using resolve and reject. We're talking about using promises. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we don't do that a lot. You know, I know we did it on one of the exams. That's probably going to be the last time you have to construct a promise for a while. I think for the rest of bootcamp, won't be doing that. We simply use promises. Yeah, thank God. Yeah, I know, because they're hard. I've got one. Let's take a look. Do I have one here? Let me dig one up here. Promise. There we go. So let's clear this out, and I'll show making a promise. So there's a basic promise. All right. Order pizza. I made a function called order pizza that returns a promise. In this case, it returns a resolved promise. Sure. Okay. I've got a resolved promise. So if I call promise, you know, I go console log. Well, of course, I got to do order pizza, order pizza, order pizza, order pizza, and with a value, I'll say ham pizza. Sure, ham pizza dot then there we go, and res, and we'll console log our res, just log our res, pretty easy, res there. I'm gonna say this is my then. Let's grab that. So console log what I got back from my res, just like that. Okay, and there. Okay, let's call that. And your pizza's ready. It's ham. Okay, so there's a resolved promise. Okay, now of course I can also reject stuff in my promise as well. Okay, I could resolve promise, or I could have a pizza that doesn't like what I gave it. In this case, I could say reject. So maybe I'll add something. I can say, you know, if value, I guess type, value equals, let's say pineapple. How do you spell pineapple? Pineapple, is that close? So E, there. Okay, pineapple pizza. If value equals pineapple, well, everyone knows that's not a real pizza, right? Any Italian knows that Hawaiian pizzas, that's not a real pizza, is it? No. So I'm going to reject that. I'm going to say no. I'm going to say, there. I'm going to reject that. I'm going to say reject that. Reject. There. And I'm going to say, that's not a pizza. There. Okay. Now I have to return that. So I'm going to return the promise, right? And I can return this too. There. Make it easier. There we go. So yes. Okay. So are they reserved words? Actually, no, they're not. They are functions on the promise object. In this case, the promise prototype, which is of course the capital P promise. So they are what are called prototype functions. So I'm calling promise.reject. Just like promise.all, it's capital P promise.all, promise reject, and promise resolve. So now, if I give pineapple to my order pizza, I'm going to get unhandled promise rejection, right? Exactly right. So I'm getting an unhandled promise rejection. That's not a pizza. So I have to catch that. Okay. So the dot catch, just like that, E and log E. E. There we go. Okay. And that's not a pizza. Exactly. All right. So these aren't easy. Like, I don't like doing this. This is like hard stuff. Like, we don't do many of these. Like as I mentioned, I've done like a couple in the last little while because, you know, everything I use is pretty much a promise-based module anyways. If I'm doing my own stuff, the more, you know, wild stuff, sure, I may need to build my own promise, but really you will likely not be doing this stuff for a while. Okay. So yeah, you won't have to worry about this. Other than that exam you had to write, we had to do a timeout with the reject resolve. That's probably the last promise you're going to have to make in a while. You'll be spending your time instead using other people's promises like Axios and PG and other ones as well. So, all right. Okay. Okay, well, that's it for promises. I will talk to everyone later. See you guys later on, and I'll be seeing certainly the West guys during Rack Week a lot. So, and I'm looking forward to seeing the midterm presentations. That's gonna be cool. Okay, everyone.